Well, when before we graduated medical school, we were given the option of those hospitals where we wanted to intern, and we were given three choices. Number one, of course, would be our best choice, and then the second and third choices usually were those that the candidates did not really care to go to, but they were forced to name hospitals. But I wanted to go to county because there was so much experience that one could get from going to this large, really world-famous institution. 10% of all the doctors in the United States at that time had some training at Cook County Hospital. So of course that was my first choice, and I was hoping that they would accept me. I don't recall the number they did accept, but it had to be large, and yet for those who didn't get it, it was terribly small. After a couple of weeks, I got a letter which accepted me. And the saying was, and I may have said this before, that you could always tell a county boy, but you couldn't tell them much. They did everything, they saw everything, they thought, and some of them were really quite accomplished by the time their internship ended. There were very few places available for a residency at the county, particularly in the surgical fields, general surgery, accepted, perhaps 3, 4, 5 candidates. Orthopedic surgery accepted 3. The other specialties, OB-GYN, accepted a small number. So getting a residency there was really quite an accomplishment. It meant that you had to be recommended by those chiefs of staff who knew of you for your internship work. I was really quite conscientious, as were, I think, most of the fellows during internship, though I had a little difficulty getting a residency position in orthopedic surgery. In the general surgery, the surgery resident, and most of the surgery was done by the residents. They would call in their chief only if they had a difficult case or anticipated difficulty with a case, which really was quite infrequent. But in general surgery, as an intern, I went with my senior resident to amputate a case of a diabetic man who had lost the arterial supply to a leg, which meant that he had to have an amputation above the knee. And I remember the resident's name. He was from Connecticut. It was Berger Carlson. Carlson said, "All right, Al." He says, "You're going to do the amputation." I was honored, but to say I was frightened, I think was probably correct. We applied the tourniquet on the thigh, and he told me where the incisions were to be made, and so I did. as I made the incisions after the tourniquet had been applied, there was still some bleeding, and the bleeding spurted. The vessels spurted, and I was covered with blood. He said, "That's all right." He said, "We'll get the bleeder." And of course he helped me with that. The case went well, of course, but it was a memorable experience, and fortunately in my own practice I had few diabetic gangrenous limbs to amputate. That was one. And then there were individuals, patients who were unusual. There was one girl, she may have been in her early 20s, and she had extra parts. That is, she had 3 legs. I was invited by one of my friends to see that. I didn't operate. So everything, and there was even a case of leprosy or Hansen's disease, and there were this individual with fingers missing. And my first service as an intern was in the tuberculosis hospital, and there I saw the patients who suffered terribly from the ravages of the disease. And believe it or not, we didn't take many precautions. That is, I think about it now, we didn't wear masks. Of course, we had our gowns when we were lavaging or giving fluids or washing open wounds. And it wasn't until several years later, when I was a resident, that streptomycin had been available, and many of these tubercular wounds were healed. It was streptomycin plus 1 or 2 other drugs given in conjunction with that. But that was a miracle that had happened in our time. We had a girl on the orthopedic ward. She was the young thing. She was about 17 or 18, and the tuberculous lesions had involved her vertebrae. So she was hunched at maybe 100 degrees. So her bed had to be lifted in the back so she could see us. And when streptomycin was introduced, the lesions in her back healed. Of course, the deformity didn't change, but this was a person on her way to being healed in her deformed position. But it was really a miracle in our time. And think about tuberculosis and syphilis, these drugs, these diseases that had compromised men for all the hundreds of years, really for thousands. And suddenly there was hope, there was healing. This was an unbelievable, and it was unbelievable to some of the attending staff who had lived through all the promises of drugs before that were ineffective for these diseases. So it was a grand time, really. It was a magnificent time to be a doctor, to be able to have a tool, something that would actually heal or cause the healing. That was true of leprosy as well. There was a drug to cure that. The leprosariums no longer needed to exist because anybody with the disease was treated. And I don't know that the leprosarium exists today in Louisiana, and the tuberculosis hospital, I think, has been raised. It was the oldest building on the medical campus anyway. And the terrible coughing and sputum and everything that went with the disease, and the collapsed lungs, and all of that disappeared. All through the latter part of the internship and the first part of the residency, these things had occurred. When I presented these cases as a resident, several of them, the attending staff, some of the men, were highly skeptical. They said, "Oh, yeah, sure." And they were unbelieving because they had been disappointed in the past, but one could understand their skepticism. And now the treatment was really bona fide. It was really occurring before their eyes, so they could no longer disregard that which was occurring. Well, at Cook County, the price one paid for being allowed to learn there was the penurious salaries, if that's what one could call it. The people in charge didn't even provide us with uniforms, so that what we wore, we inherited from fellows who had gone through the program before us, so that we used to laugh and say our patches had patches. As an intern, I think we received $15 a month, and then when the interns threatened to strike, since most of them were veterans, they upped the monthly income to $25. And I think I received $50 a month as a resident, which was hardly a livable wage. I had the good fortune to be tutored by specialists who were kind and giving of their knowledge. They would do a case and watch over me, as I did the same case, and without wanting to brag, we sometimes did the surgery better than one or two of the attending men. But anyway, it was not a living wage. I had a youngster who was 2 or 3 years old, 3 or 4, and I had to have, like most of the residents, a source of income so that doing outside work, by that I mean finding a doctor who needed assistance, was of paramount importance. If we were able to maintain some type of livelihood, and of course this had to be at times when we were available. One day, a resident in medicine approached me and said, "Al, how would you like to open a, quote, clinic, unquote, on the south side of Chicago? We could make some money and we could live perhaps a near normal life with the money that we make." I said, "No, I can't do that." Besides, it was against the rules of the department, the orthopedic surgical department. We had been warned by the chief of the department that if we engaged in outside work, we would be asked to leave the service. I said, "I can't risk that." He said, can you afford to maintain a livelihood for your family without borrowing money? I said, well, I've already borrowed money, but I'm really opposed to the idea. And he persuaded me to give it a go. He says, look, he says, you do outside work now when you're free on weekends. I had some weekends when I wasn't on call. An example was taking call on a weekend in Gary, Indiana, in a clinic where the occasional worker would come in with a medical or surgical problem, and for 2 days' work I would get a check of $100, which was quite a bit at that time, and I was grateful. And then my dad had a grocery store, and I was able to work for him on some weekends, and I would fill 2 25-pound bags with groceries, and that would sustain us for a week or two. But getting back to this so-called clinic that this medical resident suggested, he said, look, I have a place mapped out. It's in the heart of the black neighborhood. He said it's an empty storefront. We can remodel it cheaply. He says, and we can see patients after our regular hourly working at the hospital. Well, our regular hourly working at the hospital meant really getting away in an unorthodox manner, since we were required to spend time at the hospital, and we didn't have at that time iPads or phones in which to keep in touch. But anyway, it was possible to have someone cover hours while we were gone. And after a couple of years in orthopedic surgery, I had been chosen as the chief resident in orthopedics, so I could designate some of the duties to my underlings. And I looked at this store on the south side of Chicago. It had been, I don't know what, a clothing store or whatever. And this fellow, this medical resident, said to me, look, you design what you need, and I have someone I can call to have this place fixed up so that it'll be open and ready for business in maybe 3 or 4 weeks. I said, God, that doesn't seem possible, but at that time I was pretty desperate because my little family was really suffering from a lack of funds. And we were living in a building which my folks owned. Of course, we didn't pay rent, and there was very little furniture in our flat. Well, we got hold of a colored guy, I remember his name, Walker, who came by, and he was a jack of all trades, and he looked at this store, this without light, without heat, without anything, and he looked at my plans, and he said, yeah, he thought he could get this ready in a month. Fine. So we borrowed some some money, more money, and gave him enough to buy supplies, paint, lumber, and electrical equipment, and he started working. Well, by the end of the month, it looked as though he had only a year's work left, and then he wouldn't show up. I figured he was probably looped somewhere, you know. But he did finally show up, and after a month and a half or 2 months, the place was ready for patients. And we went out and bought the least expensive, really cheap furniture at the local Sears store. And the sign painter painted the window, the Greenwood Medical Center. That was the area, Greenwood. And of course the patients got excellent care because they had excellent doctors, and some of the doctors who had been in the area really were not first rate. One of the patients came in, an obese woman, and sat down on one of our cheap chairs and broke it and fell to the floor. Fortunately, she didn't break any bones. We helped her up and helped her with her medical problem. And we saw a reasonable number of patients, and we were making a living. And a surgeon came in. He was a licensed, certified general surgeon. His name was Hershey, and he did the surgical patients. At the end of the year, I had to find something else to do because my residency had ended. It was a 2-year residency. So I sold my share of the practice to the general surgeon, and he was happy to have it, which was several $1,000s. And I got a position with this prominent orthopedic surgeon who had an office with a Tony address on Michigan Boulevard in Chicago. But in keeping with the past, he paid, what I thought was a decent salary, but really wasn't. And my wife thought that, well, all right, for the first year, $12,000 would be acceptable. Now here we were living in this flat, rent-free, no furniture to speak of, and the children would sit on the bare floor watching this huge TV set with a small picture. It was a big box with a small picture. We had 2 children then, 2 girls. There was 3 years and I think 4 months difference in age. Liz was probably, 6, and Shelby was 3. They were good children, gave us little trouble. After the first year, Liz was a baby who was unfortunately allergic to milk, cow's milk, and my wife could not breastfeed her, so she was losing weight and losing her life, really, as a very young child. I was an intern at the time, and the child was brought to the Illinois Research and Education Hospital, and there they managed to give her IVs. She had no veins because all of her little veins had been used up, so they gave her an IV in the fontanelle in the skull. She managed to pull through. They found that she was able to digest mulsoy, a milk made of from the soybean, and I will be forever grateful to the Borden Company who furnished us this product for as long as we needed it. She thrived on that, and of course she is a healthy youngster. And I did learn quite a bit with this doctor, this prominent doctor, who was also a friend of my oldest brother. It just happened. He followed the routine of most doctors, established doctors at that time, who would have assistants, and the assistants were paid poorly because the thinking was, well, as an attending, as an established surgeon, I'm giving you all of my experience, and with what you'll get, you'll be able to handle cases on your own one day. Well, the one day for some of the doctors didn't occur because they were entirely dependent upon the practicing or experienced doctor. Well, I worked with this doctor for a year, and our home was still without furniture. So my wife said, well, what proposal was made? I had talked with this doctor and asked him what he planned for me. Actually, I didn't. He's the one who approached me, and he said he would give me an extra $1,000 for the year. Well, I mentioned that to my wife, and she said, no way in Hades is that going to work out. She says, you've gone to school and training forever. She says, it's time for you to strike out on your own. And she wasn't a girl or a woman who was avaricious or wanted a great deal. She just wanted more than what she was getting. And she said, $1,000 more won't do it. She said, from this point on, you're going to go into practice for yourself. And that, a decision like that isn't easy to accept for many people, of which I was one. So I approached my chief at the Cook County Hospital. For the past year, I had been on the staff there, on the teaching staff, and I talked to him, talked to the chief, and I said, what would you advise me to do? In Chicago at that time, there was a pernicious practice known as splitting fees, where a referring doctor would refer a patient and expect the surgeon to split a fee with him. And my chief, who would not participate in anything like that, he was, a straight John and a good man, said, look, he said, get your ass out of here. You go to the West Coast, go to California. He says, where they don't do that sort of thing, not yet. He said, and start your practice. He said, go to someone who is in practice and who needs an assistant, and I'll tell you who to see. He was a good teacher and a fair surgeon, but he was strict. He said, go see this man who practiced in Chicago for many years and is now in LA. He wants an assistant, I know. He said, and don't accept anything less than a good salary from him. So he said, and the sooner you do it, the better. And you get there, he said, you rent a car. He said, and don't rent a cheap car. He said, make an impression, get a big car, and report to him. Tell him you're coming. So I got in touch with this doctor, and he was pleased. He said, yes, certainly, come by. So the only car available was a Ford. So that was fine. And LA at that time, the year now was, what did I say, 1955 or so, was so different. I could remember smelling the orange blossoms and the warmth. I think I left during the cold months, and the air was clean. There was no smog. Oh, how wonderful. I wound up in this fellow's office, short, bald man, very busy, waiting room full of patients. His office, certificates from the big athletic organizations. He was quite popular. He was popular in Chicago, he was popular in LA. So he told me all of the advantages, and he says, and by the way, he says, I've got prostate cancer, and he says, I don't know how much longer I have to live. Well, he was a man about 70 years of age, I would think. He says, and then the practice becomes yours. So in all my youthful knowledge, I said, doctor, I said, he who waits for someone to die usually waits in vain. I said, besides, I've got friends up north who I want to see before leaving California. He says, fine. He says, I'll give you my airline credit card. He said, and you can fly Southwest up there. And I said, no, thank you. I didn't want to be beholden to him. I flew up north and stayed with my friends in, where did they live? It was near Oakland anyway. And I stayed with them, I think, almost a week. And he said, there are new areas going up where you'll be more than welcome. And he didn't want me to stay in Oakland. He didn't need any competition. So I took a look at the area. Well, I think it was Walnut Creek, and it was row upon row of framework. And I said, God, I had to wait until people got into these places before I'd have a practice. So I left for LA, and I thought I would start with someone who would permit me to use his office space. Didn't offer me a salary, which was fine, but he did give me a couple of referrals. One was the South Pacific Railroad clinic, and another was an industrial clinic. So that was fine. And I told my wife, and she moved out with the two little girls, And before they came out, I found a home that had just been renovated, and an old cottage in West LA, in a lovely neighborhood with a street at the end of the block, with a school at the end of the street. How wonderful could that have been? And so my little girls had only to walk to school, and in this backyard was an enormous barbecue and a mature orange tree full of oranges. I mean, it was a glorious find, and I had spotted it because the painters had been putting the finishing coats of paint on the outside. Lovely established neighborhood. That was the beginning of the Los Angeles venture. Unfortunately, payment from these two sources came at the end of a month. So again, we had to live through the month to get paid. But I wasn't there very long, because what happened, we were living in LA proper, the west side of the city, and I had friends living in the valley, in the San Fernando Valley, which meant that there was a mountain pass between the two areas, so that if I wanted to get to the valley, I had to go through the mountain pass. At that time, I had a 54 Dodge. I had doctor friends in the valley. The valley was burgeoning at that time. And one of my friends, a radiologist, we had gone to school together, said, "Al," he said, "come into the valley. You'll be busy the moment you get here." He said, "Come here. You'll work the emergency rooms at the hospitals." There were at least 2 hospitals where the admitting doctor would see patients and triage them. I said, "Fine." I did that, and sure enough, there were people that I could treat there, and having made the trip to and from the city to the valley was beginning to wear a bit, especially during the nights when accidents occurred. The passes were not lit, and they were curvy. Now that I think about it, they were treacherous. We lived in the city for about, a year, and then I said, we can't do this. I can't go through these passes, mountain passes. So we found a place in the valley, a flat in an apartment. I made application to the hospitals, became a staff member, and I had surgical cases. So I had to establish an office, and I found a building in Panorama City. This must have been 1957, 58. Several of the doctors were referring orthopedic cases, trauma cases, to me. So I had patients in hospitals and needed an office for post-op care. And the office became inadequate. In the meantime, I had been asked by one of my friends to attend the Children's Hospital, the Los Angeles Children's Hospital. So I did that, and it was there that I found a candidate who was completing his orthopedic residency, and I asked him whether he would like to join me. Now I was the senior partner, and he was working on a salary for me. Having remembered how little I was paid as an assistant, I wasn't going to make some silly offer to the assistant after the first year. I found him to be satisfactory. He was fine as an assistant. I said, we'll become partners. So he became a full partner. We worked together for a couple of years, and the practice continued to grow almost beyond management, so we had to have another orthopedic surgeon, and someone came to us out of a residency. So there were three of us. Now, in the meantime, we had increased our office space again. So we occupied quite a few feet in this building in Panorama City. And then my dentist approached me and said, Al, how about having our own office in a large first-class medical dental building that we will build? Yeah. Well, we had to have something better than what we had. So I said, fine. And that was another adventure. And this large building, the largest building in the Panorama City community, went up, and there were myriad problems. We lost ownership in the building before it got built, and that's just as well. So it became the property of known builders. But we occupied the uppermost floor, the 15th floor of the building, and it was a large space, quite modern, and had an adequate waiting room and office, and we had a half a dozen girls working for us. It went quite well for several years, but I was still getting most of the new patients. After all, I had been there the longest, and one friend said, and I might be repeating this, but it was like a three-legged stool, so that it becomes unstable, or could. And sure enough, that's what happened. I think there was competition had begun to rear its ugly head, along with greed. These two wanted more than I thought was necessary to maintain a proper practice. Truth of the matter is, I was seeing as more than they saw combined in any week or month of new patients. And one of the last fellow who joined our group, he turned out to be more demanding of, he thought that we could get more if we advertised. I said, no, that's beyond my ken. I could not advertise. This is undignified. Doctors, I thought, should never advertise. It's supposed to be a noble profession, not commercialized. He thought that by having someone present us on TV, say, as doing thus and such, that this would give us the publicity to increase our patient load. And the thing that I did not want to do was increase the patient load, because there's a never-ending type of scheme that gives you little of that which you really want, which is some time for yourself and family. Well, a resolution was not possible. I knew that. There was just too much difference in opinion on how the practice should work. And these two thought they could do well on their own. And the last man, I'm sure, who was the greedier of the two, was all for splitting off. And I thought it was time. And there were several reasons for that. Number one, my wife was showing increased signs of dementia, and I wanted to get her away from the environment, not knowing much about the disease other than the fact that she was not improving and probably being made worse by being with her friends. I thought perhaps she would be embarrassed. I didn't know that much about the disease or Alzheimer's. And secondly, the air was so bad in the valley that there were times when I couldn't see beyond a mile or two on the freeway when I was driving, and I was responding physically to that. My eyes would tear and my nose would run, and I was beginning to have difficulty breathing the air. And then the business with the partners was untenable. So there were several reasons for getting out.